The house had a lot of issues with its past. A lot of deaths had occurred there before my family moved in. Most recently, the people renting it out to my mom and stepdad didn't want to live there anymore because their son had decided to opt out of life. Before that, there were even a few murders. We didn't know the details, but that's what the landlords told us. I was young when my mom met my stepdad, and shortly after they met, they moved in together. I didn't experience anything weird until my baby sister came along, and that's when everything went wrong. The house had 2 bedrooms, so I had to share a room with my baby sister. We'll call her B. She never stopped crying, and when I was young, I absolutely couldn't stand her. I remember this one night, though, when she was crying for hours. Then, all of a sudden, she stopped. I looked over and saw the shadowy figure hovering over her crib. It didn't move much, but when it did, it was slow and airy. I was terrified and hid under my covers, eventually falling asleep from exhaustion. The next day, when I told my parents, they just thought it was my imagination. But it happened again and again, waking up to see a figure beside my sister's crib. Always by the crib, nowhere else in the room. After a while of complaining, I ended up sleeping in my parents' room with my mom, while my stepdad slept in my room. But things didn't get better. They kept happening. Soon after I started seeing this figure, my stepdad lost his job. He was a hardworking person, so it really shocked my mom when it happened. He went through a rough depression. He really loved his job, and losing it must have been devastating for him. I remember him sitting on the couch, day after day, just watching TV. One day, when I got home from school, I walked in to find him sitting on the couch, with a dark figure standing behind him. I remember it so clearly, just standing behind the couch. I didn't know what to do, so I started crying. My stepdad took me to my room to calm me down. That night, when my mom came home, I told them both what I had seen. Again, my stepdad seemed disinterested, and my mom just seemed annoyed. No one believed me. After that, there were a few weeks where nothing happened, followed by weeks of the figure hanging around. It was usually by B or my stepdad. Some nights, when I slept in my room, I would hear a woman's voice coming from B's crib. It was just talking to her. I never understood the words, but it terrified me every time. As B got older and began to walk and talk, I noticed she spent a lot of time in that room, talking to her friend. My parents never seemed to worry about it, saying it was just her imaginary friend. But I knew what it was. The more this figure hung around, the worse the emotions in the house became. My sister became a mute, never talking to anyone. My mom had so much anger inside her, and my stepdad was always depressed. I was alone most of the time. Then my parents started fighting all the time, screaming at each other, saying horrible things. My mom hated my stepdad for not being able to keep a job, and my stepdad was just a mess. They fought every single night, and each night it got worse. One night, I even heard my stepdad telling my mom to put the knife down. But the worst of all was the night I stayed up late in the living room watching TV. It wasn't that late, maybe 8:30, and my stepdad was asleep on the couch while my mom was in her room, also tired. I turned off the TV and started walking upstairs to my room. At the top of the stairs, I began to hear whispering, followed by me speaking back to the whispers. The door was cracked open a few inches, and I slowly walked over to look inside. Just a couple of steps from the door, I could see it, next to the figure, as if it were trying to lead her somewhere. I screamed. Instantly, the door slammed shut. I stood there, screaming and crying, until my mom rushed out of her room. I just pointed at the door, unable to make out any words. She tried to open it, but it was locked. It was one of those cheap doors, so she was able to twist the lock with her fingernail and push it open. B was in the corner of the room, facing a wall. My mom yelled at her for locking the door, but she was too short to even reach the doorknob. B didn't even seem to have any reaction. After that, I fell into a depression just like the rest of my family. No one talked to each other, no one asked me how I was. I became the one taking care of my baby sister. I grew more and more familiar with the strange figure. It even started hanging around my bed during nights when I was particularly sad. And strangely, it brought me a weird comfort, knowing that I wasn't truly alone. Eventually, my mom had enough of my dad, and we left to stay with my grandparents. I remember her telling us to pack up, and as we headed to the car, I saw the figure again, standing by my dad. I felt a pang of sadness leaving him behind, but at least he wouldn't truly be alone. I live in a small neighborhood home in the suburbs of a large city. For almost 3 years, I had a roommate who lived there with me. He eventually moved out into his own place, and at that point, I was able to afford the rent by myself, so I didn't bother finding a new roommate. However, during the weeks following his absence, I began to experience things I couldn't explain. I had never believed in anything paranormal before, but now, I'm not so sure. Started one night when I had to work late. I didn't get home until around 8, and after doing my usual, making dinner, sitting down to watch some TV, I began scrolling through movies. That's when I first heard it. The wooden floorboards creaked upstairs. This wasn't entirely uncommon due to the house being old, but it was always in a distinct pattern, as if someone was walking. It would happen often, and at first I had learned to ignore it. But tonight was different. The creaking continued for nearly 30 minutes. I muted the TV and listened, my heart racing. The noises traveled slowly, moving room to room across the entire upstairs. This time, it was too much. It definitely freaked me out more than usual. My mind raced. Was there someone upstairs? I stood up and shouted, hoping to scare whoever it was, or at least confirm it was just the old house creaking. But as soon as I shouted, the noise stopped. I waited, holding my breath, listening for anything else. But there was nothing. Silence. After a few long minutes of standing there, I decided to check upstairs myself. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife just in case, and slowly made my way up. I checked each room, going from one to the next, examining every corner. But there was nothing. Everything was just as it should be. Nothing out of place, no signs of anyone being there. I figured it had to be just a strange coincidence, the noise stopping as soon as I shouted. I tried to calm myself down and made my way back to the couch, hoping to forget about it. I ended up going to bed around midnight after watching a short movie. I laid there in bed for a while, still really tired, but for some reason, I just couldn't fall asleep. The feeling in the house was off, but I couldn't explain why. After some time, I got up to use the bathroom. The way my house is set up, my bedroom is on the right side of the hallway upstairs, and the bathroom is directly across from it on the left. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. That's when I heard it, whispering. It came from down the hallway, from the spare bedroom where my roommate used to stay. At first, I thought I might be imagining it, but the voices sounded so real. I stood still, frozen for a moment, trying to collect myself. The whispers grew louder. I slowly moved toward the spare bedroom, my heart pounding. When I reached the door, I leaned in, pressing my ear against it. The voices were indistinct, almost like a conversation in a language I didn't recognize. The sound grew louder as I stood there, and it seemed as though the whispers were getting closer, as if they were right on the other side of the door. I stood there for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I had never believed in anything paranormal before, and even then, I refused to believe it. I'm a bigger guy, and I don't scare easily. But then, in a surge of anger and adrenaline, I pushed the door open, ready to confront whoever, or whatever, was in there. The door creaked loudly as it swung open, and I was met with nothing. An empty room. The silence was deafening. My whole world stood still. In that moment, I was more terrified than I had ever been in my life. The horror that surged through my body was unbearable. It felt as though the air itself had thickened, pressing in on me from all sides. My legs went weak, and without thinking, I turned and ran out of the house, straight to my parked car. I sat in the car, staring at the house. My heart was still racing, and I could barely catch my breath. My hands trembled as I fumbled to call my roommate. It was so late I wasn't sure he'd pick up, but thankfully he did. I could barely speak, my voice shaking as I told him what had just happened. He could tell something was seriously wrong, because he had never seen me scared like that. But what he said next sent chills down my spine. He wasn't surprised. He mentioned, almost casually, that he had heard things in that house before. He'd always brushed it off, never thinking much of it. But now, hearing me so terrified, he seemed to realize that maybe something had been there all along. That night was an experience I'll never forget. Changed everything for me. It changed my beliefs on the paranormal. And honestly, I don't even know what to believe anymore. It's been over a month since that happened, and I've started sleeping on the couch downstairs every night instead of my bedroom. But still, every once in a while, I wake up and I hear it again. The creaking of the wooden floors upstairs, slowly moving room to room. Every night, it's always the same. And now, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that house before is still there, waiting. This happened several years ago, back in February of 2001. My friend, who I will call Jake for privacy reasons, invited me on a long weekend trip to a remote cabin that his uncle owned in northern Saskatchewan. I agreed to join him, and so we drove the long 6 hours from my house to get there. Let me give you a brief layout of the grounds before we continue. The cabin was a small, single-story ranch-style building with a kitchen, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, and a living room. There was no electricity or running water, and it was surrounded by thick forest on all sides. The only way in or out was down a long, unpaved driveway. We arrived at the cabin around dusk the next day. After settling in, Jake and I decided to take a walk around the forest to search for firewood. About an hour into our walk, Jake spotted something strange in the distance, an abandoned house nestled among a group of trees. This was odd, considering we were deep in northern Saskatchewan, miles away from civilization. Jake, driven by curiosity, wanted to check out the house. I hesitated, feeling uneasy, but reluctantly joined him. We approached the house and entered through a boarded-up window. As soon as we stepped inside, we were greeted by a musty, stale air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. While exploring the house, I noticed a door leading down to a basement. Something compelled me to open it, and against my better judgment, I slowly descended the creaky steps. When I reached the bottom, I froze. There were dimly lit candles arranged in a perfect circle, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows. It was as though someone had recently performed a ritual. My flashlight scanned the basement, revealing nothing but dust and cobwebs. But then, I noticed an empty alcove hidden behind the stairs. I crept closer, my heart pounding, when something caught my eye. It was a black figure, standing in the shadows beneath the stairs. My stomach twisted in fear. The figure was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and when its eyes met mine, I knew instantly that I was in the presence of something inhuman. Its glowing red eyes burned with an intense malice that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl echoed through the basement. Without a moment's hesitation, I bolted up the stairs, my breath catching in my throat. Jake, still exploring the empty dining room, heard me scrambling up the stairs and called out to me. I screamed at him, "Get out of here!" My panic was palpable, but Jake didn't hesitate. He followed me to the window, and we both hurriedly left through the same way we entered. But our story didn't end there. When we finally returned to the cabin, I told Jake everything I had seen. To my surprise, he believed me. We agreed to put it behind us and get some rest. But that night, as I lay in bed, I suddenly woke up and checked the time on my watch. It was 2:17 a.m. The cabin was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Something didn't feel right. After a moment, I heard subtle footsteps outside the bedroom door. It was the kind of sound that made my skin crawl. Just then, Jake stirred beside me. "What's going on?" he whispered, his voice thick with concern. "Shoo!" I hushed him, holding up my finger to my lips. "Listen." The footsteps grew louder, growing closer to our door. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Slowly, I got out of bed and tiptoed toward the door, my heart racing. I cracked it open just enough to peer outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the living room stood the creature, the same one I had seen in the basement of the abandoned house. Its form was twisted and unnatural, barely visible in the dim moonlight. But the most horrifying thing was its face. The creature slowly twisted its head, its glowing red eyes locking directly onto the bedroom door. No, onto me. My pulse shot into overdrive, and before I could think, I slammed the door shut, locking it in panic. "Jake, we need to go," I gasped, my voice barely above a whisper, trembling with fear. We scrambled to open the window, our breaths shallow and erratic. We left everything behind, our bags, our gear, anything that could slow us down. We bolted from the cabin and ran toward Jake's truck as fast as we could. But just as we reached the truck, we both heard it. An ear-piercing scream, like nothing we had ever heard before. It echoed through the night, chilling us to the bone. We didn't look back. Jake started the truck, floored it, and we sped away without saying a word, not daring to speak of what we had seen. The silence in the truck was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and our heavy breathing. It's been nearly 20 years since that night, and Jake and I are still friends to this day, but we've never returned to his uncle's cabin. I don't know what we saw that night, whether it was some kind of paranormal entity or an unknown creature living deep in the woods, but I'm not in any rush to find out.